Day 8 of the World Series of Poker Main Event 2024. 14 players remain of a field of over 10,000. We're watching Chrissy B, Kristen Foxen, one of the sharpest, most analytical minds to ever play the game.
Joe's been pretty solid, right?
I would think so. I mean, he hasn't had the best seat today, right? He didn't have all those chips to begin with. He had...
In this exact split second, an electric flash of absolute conviction hits her chest.
Ostet to his left. She's going
She
all
says
in.
all in.
It is a profound, blinding sense of certainty telling her to slide her entire stack across the line on a massive bluff. To the casual viewer watching on screen, this seems like a catastrophic error. Online forums will scream punt for weeks and weeks. They are analyzing the wrong map. This has nothing to do with technical skill and everything to do with biological physics. Looking back at our earlier dissection of metabolic panic, our brain has a tendency to counterfeit certainty as a survival mechanism. The vagal brake failure we discussed in the last video was a physiological collapse, a system-wide retreat from the unbearable heat of the environment. That was a bottom-up panic. What we are witnessing here, in a player of Kristen Foxen's caliber, is far more insidious. It's a top-down, predatory optimization failure. We are moving from the reactive redline state into the structural failure of decision-making itself. When the prefrontal cortex grows exhausted by the multi-day computational grind at high stakes, it becomes a corrupt accountant. It stops searching for the truth and starts foraging for the easiest possible narrative that allows us to terminate the labor of thinking. This is where information foraging theory becomes the critical lens. In ecology, an organism decides to leave a patch, a resource-rich area, when the cost of searching for the next bit of food exceeds the value of what is currently found. In the brain, the prefrontal cortex is constantly evaluating the patch of a current decision-making environment. When we get tired, the internal math shifts. The brain starts hallucinating genius in low-quality data. It wants to convince us that the shortcut it has found is actually an epiphany. In this video, we're identifying the mechanism of the punt and dismantling the patch exit rule that governs it. We're exposing how a tired brain gaslights the executive center into believing that a desperate shortcut is a masterpiece of aggression. We are mapping out exactly why the prefrontal cortex designs these epiphanies when it can no longer afford the metabolic price of genuine analysis. And most importantly, we're building a diagnostic framework to prevent the biological sabotage before our hardware decides to liquidate our tournament life. To understand how we end up in these self-sabotaging spirals, we look to a framework called information foraging theory. Developed by Peter Piroli and Stuart Card, this theory was originally designed to explain how animals find food in the wild. An animal must decide whether to stay in a patch, a specific area where resources are currently being gathered, or to leave and search for a new, potentially better one. The patch exit rule is the mathematical threshold where the effort of searching for more food becomes too expensive compared to the reward of staying put. In our brains, the prefrontal cortex acts as a manager of this information foraging. It constantly calculates whether the information we're getting from a hand, the way an opponent bets, the board texture, the history of the session, provides enough high-quality data to justify the massive metabolic cost of staying focused and analytical. Neuroscientists like Matthew Rushworth and Timothy Behrens have mapped this process directly to the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or DACC. The research demonstrates that this specific region of the brain acts as a real-time monitor for foraging value. It acts as an internal auditor that signals when the rewards of the current path are no longer worth the cost of the search. Under normal conditions, our brain is an honest accountant. It keeps a precise ledger of energy expenditure and information yield. However, when we are deep in the grind, we hit a wall. As noted in the work of Joshua Brown and William Alexander regarding the predicted response outcome model, Our brain learns to represent states where the costs of action are high. When we're exhausted, our brain loses the ability to track those costs accurately. This is where the gaslighting begins. Instead of correctly identifying that our decision-making patch is depleted, our tired prefrontal cortex tries to optimize the situation and invents a shortcut. It identifies a patch exit that doesn't really exist. It does not tell us that we are tired and that we should leave the table or focus on preserving our tournament life. It creates a false epiphany. It points to a specific single piece of information, like the fact that a player has played 3 hands in a row, and assigns it an artificially inflated value. It convinces us that the data is profound, the pattern is certain, and that the only logical move is a massive terminal action. We are being tricked by our own biological math. The brain is not failing to function. It is actually functioning perfectly fine in identifying a patch exit rule based on corrupt data. It purposefully makes the decision to shove or bluff feel like a moment of high-level intuition, because that's the fastest way to terminate the patch and stop the grueling work of analysis. In the poker environment, this manifests as the optimal punt. We feel a surge of clarity. We see the board and the opponent's action, and our brain presents us with a masterstroke bluff that explains away all the tension that we're holding. It is a masterpiece of deception, but it is not directed at our opponents. It is directed at our own executive center. We're being gaslit by our hardware. The solution is not to try harder or be more disciplined in the moment. The solution is to recognize the abrupt, aggressive certainty as a diagnostic marker for a tired prefrontal cortex. We have to be precise about what we are feeling at the table, because we do know the difference. The flood is the adrenal overload, the slow, systemic accumulation of somatic noise that eventually drowns out our ability to process the board. Intuition is that quiet 2-second flicker of raw insight before a rational brain steps in to overcomplicate the play. The patch exit is neither. It is a cognitive corruption. It arrives as an electric, jagged spike of certainty that cuts through the murky exhaustion of a long grind. It feels like a tactical insight, but its only purpose is to kill the metabolic tax of the work. The question we must ask is why the brain defaults to this specific failure mode under pressure. If the DACC is auditing our energy expenditure, what happens to the internal ledger when we cross the threshold into total exhaustion? To understand the mechanics of this internal sabotage, let's look at how our biological processing of value, risk, and effort begins to deteriorate when the metabolic tax of the grind becomes too high to sustain. Before the punt manifests, the hardware sends signals that we are losing objective analytical capacity. We look for these 3 distinct shifts in our internal processing. It arrives as a violent, hollow click that cuts off the mental grind. A sudden, sharp lightness that mimics clarity, but feels like the abrupt quieting of heavy, ongoing noise. It lacks the quiet, layered weight of intuition, and instead presents as an impatient, electric demand to stop thinking immediately. It pops up like a physical itch to prune away all the confusing, messy details of the hand. We experience an aggressive impatience with ambiguity, where the urge to tidy up our thoughts into one simple, neat story feels like a relief rather than a strategic revelation. This feels like our awareness is being physically pinched into a single point. We experience an intense, impatient drive to resolve the current tension right now, making every other variable, our stack, the field, the long term, feel strangely dismissively irrelevant, like static we are suddenly bored of listening to. When these markers appear, we're being gaslit by our own hardware. We do not attempt to think harder because our executive capacity is already corrupted. Instead, we implement a hard stop. Number 1, audit the physical. We perform a rapid scan of our autonomic state. Is our jaw clenched? Are we holding our breath? Has our pulse spiked without a change in the game state? If the answer is yes, we're in a state of metabolic panic. We reset our physiology before we make a decision. Number 2, the inversion query. We intentionally invert our conviction. If the brain screams shove, we spent 3 seconds articulating a bulletproof argument for folding. We do not need to choose the fold. We need to break the cycle by proving to our hardware that the initial path is not the only path. Number 3, the commitment to patch maintenance. We accept that the feeling of boredom or tedium is a sign of a healthy analytical environment. We reframe the lack of a clear answer as a state of truth. If the hand feels messy, complicated, uncertain, then we are in the correct state for high-level play. We choose complexity over the illusion of a clean bluff. We reclaim control by identifying the patch exit rule as a bias rather than an epiphany. We're no longer waiting for the perfect read. We're managing the biological cost of our own decision-making process. We do not act until we have audited the auditor. We stay in the patch as long as the data requires, even when our tired hardware demands an escape. The patch exit rule is not exclusive to high-stakes poker. It is a fundamental feature of the human operating system and dictates how we manage resources across our entire lives. Whether it is a business project, a complex relationship, or a personal goal, our brains use the same biological logic to force us out of uncomfortable environments before the work is actually finished. In professional environments, we often face the pivot trap. We begin a complex negotiation or a business venture with clear objectives. As the timeline stretches and the complexity mounts, our prefrontal cortex begins to feel the metabolic burn. Instead of staying the course or systematically adjusting our strategy, the brain starts looking for an exit. We find flaws in our partners, dead ends in our market research, or urgent reasons to abandon a strategy that we found sound only a week ago. We convince ourselves that we're agile leaders or decisive entrepreneurs. In reality, we're just exhausted accountants of information. We're bored, we're stressed, and we're foraging for a reason to kill the tension of uncertainty. We manufacture a narrative that allows us to walk away, justifying it as a bold shift in direction. If we don't audit the auditor, we end up serial quitting successful projects simply because we could no longer tolerate the cognitive load required to finish them. This logic is perhaps most destructive in our personal lives. If a relationship hits a period of prolonged difficulty, where communication feels effortful, or the data from our partner seems ambiguous, our brain enters a state of metabolic distress. Our brain, desperate to stop the labor of emotional analysis, begins to gaslight us into believing that the relationship is a lost cause. It highlights every minor annoyance, distorts every misunderstanding, and leaves us with the certainty that we are fundamentally incompatible. We feel a sudden electric surge of conviction that it is time to leave. We call this a gut feeling or following our heart. It is neither. It is the patch exit rule. We're choosing the immediate relief of termination over the long-term, energy-intensive process of rebuilding. We're not making a relationship decision. We're making an energy conservation decision. The bridge between poker, business, and relationships is that the conviction that we're feeling doesn't necessarily have to be a source of truth. It might just be a biological signal of our current energy state. When we feel the urge to just end it, fire a client, end a partnership, or punt a hand, we must stop and ask ourselves a simple question. Am I actually seeing a dead end? Or am I just tired of paying the metabolic tax to keep looking? The difference between the high-octane panic that we previously addressed and this predatory shortcut is the difference between an emergency stop and a calculated drift. When the adrenaline spikes, the system is screaming for survival. When the prefrontal cortex begins foraging for a patch exit, the system is lying to us about the value of the path ahead. One is a collapse. The other is a corruption of our own logic. We are not victims of the game, the market, or the complexities of our personal lives. We are the architects of our own internal models. If we allow the hardware to dictate the termination of our efforts based on the metabolic cost of the struggle, we lose the capacity to see the truth. We must remain in the patch, sit in the tension, and keep auditing the auditor. The finish line of any major project is never reached by those who rely on random flashes of certainty. It is reached by those who recognize that the feeling of wanting to quit is rarely a sign of a dead end. It is merely the signal that we have finally arrived at the work that matters. Do not let the hardware decide when the game is over. Stay in the patch. Finish the cycle.